So here we see a set of workers in difference curves for our model, which now includes the risk of injury. Again, injuries are bad in our model, so wages have to increase in order to make up for the added risk and to make that worthwhile for the worker. Here, the x-axis, shows the probability of injury or the risk. And again, there's only two types of jobs. So there is 0, perfectly safe, and 1, guaranteed risky. And the y-axis shows the wages that the worker earns. So the indifference curves are going to slope upwards. That means that wages have to rise to account for the added risk. So let's suppose a worker starts out here at point P on this indifference curve U0. The only way that you could get the worker to switch from the safe job to the risky job over here is if you increase their wages. And you have to increase the wages all the way up to where this indifference curve crosses that 1 for the probability of injury. So let's have wage W hat 1, call that little up thing over the W hat. So this worker would not choose to keep the same wage and move to the riskier job in this model. So if they're at W0 here, and you try to entice them to leave that job, to take a risky job and offer them that wage down here, there's no way they'd be willing to take it. To get them to be indifferent, you would have to have this higher wage way up here at W1. Now we have 3 different indifference curves on this graph. So this gives us a good chance to show that it's possible for the worker to increase their utility. So if they move from this indifference curve here to this indifference curve up here, to the U prime 1, they would prefer either the safe job at this higher wage than before, or the riskier job at this much higher wage than either before. So maybe 2 new businesses in town open up. One of them is safe, but it pays more than their old job, and one is risky, that also pays more than the old risky job. The worker in this case would be happy to take either job because they both lie in this higher indifference curve. That means that either option provides more utility than the previous one. Now we define the worker's reservation price as the amount of money that it would take to get them to switch to the risky job. So here for this initial worker on their original indifference curve, the reservation price is the difference between the wage hat 1 here, what it would take for them to work the risky job, and what it takes for them to work the safe job, W0. So what that means is if the wages rose from W0 to W hat 1, that specific worker would not care about the extra risk. They'd be completely indifferent between the two. So it answers that dare you might have received as a kid. How much would it take you to do, this gross thing? In this case, for this worker, how much would it take you to take this riskier job? Well, the difference between W hat 1 and W0. We can look at the representative individual for our model to understand the worker's thought process. But it's important to note that different workers have different risk profiles. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more later. But just to kind of set it up for you, two of my friends, they're brothers, their older brother opened up a tree trimming business when he got back from serving Afghanistan. After his time in combat, he saw nothing wrong with climbing up trees with a chainsaw in hand because, it was nothing in comparison. I personally wouldn't do that, and I'm sure a lot of you wouldn't be willing to do that. Plenty of my friends from high school weren't even willing to do the furniture factory job that I did. Although I'm sure a big part of that was not wanting to wake up at 5:45 or start work at 5:45. So wake up way before that. So we can draw different indifference curves with different slopes to account for that. Both of my parents are in their late 60s, and they both recently retired. But even if they were still working, neither of them would work a job with any risk of injury right now, no matter how much they paid at this point in their lives. Their indifference curves would look very different from a 20-year-old guy that feels invincible because they have very different levels of risk tolerance. So now let's look at starting to determine the market for compensating differentials. Here we have a supply curve for risky jobs. Before, the y-axis for the supply and demand model was the wage. But notice here, it's not the wage. It's the W1 minus W0. It is the compensating differential for those jobs. So it's the difference between what you would get paid in the safe job versus what you would have to get paid for the risky job. So it's just a little bit different, although the way we work with it is going to be the same. This model has a slightly different goal. Its purpose is to help us understand the trade-offs between the two types of jobs, the risky jobs and safe jobs. When the difference in the wage between the risky jobs and the safe jobs is 0, that would be down here at this point, no one would be willing to take the risky job. The minimum that anyone in this market is willing to work at is this delta W hat minimum. Basically, it's the difference between these two, so the compensating differential, and the very minimum amount anyone would be willing to switch over from the safe job to the risky job. So this is like the 20-year-old kid that feels invincible, or my friend's older brother, someone who has the greatest risk tolerance of any of the workers in this group. Now, as we move up the labor supply curve here, remember that represents the willingness of each individual to work at that wage. As we move up here, it's increasing the difference in pay between the risky job and the safe job. As the difference increases, more people are, what your textbook says, bought off. They're willing to accept the increased risk as we now start paying them more and more money. So we have more workers being willing to work for this risky job. The more it increases, the more are willing to enter. Now, you may think this is crazy, that you would never accept that kind of risk. But think of a situation where you're offered $1 billion to work a risky job for 1 year. Most people, it would take a disgusting amount of money to actually work such a risky job. It would be so impractical that no one would actually offer it in the real world. But there is some amount of money, some huge amount of money, that it would take to overcome the dislike of risk. So that's represented by way up here on the curve, these super high compensating differentials. But now it takes two to tango, and it takes two sides of the market to reach equilibrium. So let's consider firms. They're going to be the demand curve here, remember. Firms have a choice about the level of safety that they offer or that they require of workers. The firm's choice depends on what level of safety is most profitable. Now, remember, they won't just go to the most lax safety standards possible. They still have to consider the level of risk that workers are willing to put up with. It's a market, and there's give or take, just like we saw give or take for the wages. So while firms may prefer offering the cheaper, riskier environment, much like they're willing to pay the lowest possible wage or would prefer to, once we start working through the labor market process, and the workers' preferences will force them to meet somewhere in the middle, just like we saw with just plain wages in the past. Now, I'm not going to take you through all the details of the firm's profit function with the cost of safety incorporated, but I do suggest that you read it on your own and get some understanding with it, because I think it's important enough for background, and you should probably have some of that to help you with this. But I want to focus on a broad takeaway here. And that is that firms have a choice of the level of safety that they provide and require of their workers, but it is costly. They reach their decision on how safe or risky the job should be based on what maximizes their profits. But again, they don't have complete control in setting whatever level they want when there is competition in the labor market. So the compensating wage differentials for a labor market are determined by the interaction of supply and demand. In this case, we see that at point P, this is the equilibrium point. That W1 minus W0 star here, that's the compensating differential. And E star is the number of workers that choose to work in the risky job. The equilibrium wage is positive. That's because workers need compensation for the additional risk. So the compensating differential here is positive, and that's above the wages that they're receiving, or that they would receive for the safe job. So what's important to note is that this compensating differential, this is the reservation price for the marginal worker. So it's how much it takes for that last worker to take that job, to bring the market into equilibrium. It doesn't have anything to do with the overall distaste for risk in the entire population. Don't think of this as some sort of average, like we're tempted to. Each worker before the marginal or the last worker in these risky jobs is overcompensated in a way. They're willing to work for this lower compensating differential down here. So they're getting some surplus from it, just like we saw workers receive surplus in the labor market equilibrium before. So they receive more compensation than the added risk that they take on. For this last worker, they are perfectly indifferent. They get just enough to move them into that more risky job.